Hi, everyone. This is Tesher Cohen, and welcome to another episode of the All Things Interesting podcast, where it is my goal to share with you the unique stories of individuals across a wide range of backgrounds, to deconstruct the passion and meaning behind what they do, and to provide you some guidance along the way. On today's episode, my guest is Idan Ariel, a clinical psychology PhD specializing in treating and researching addiction. Over the course of the episode, we discuss the various approaches to handling addiction, the roots behind it, the pro-addiction stance, and many more. This is a phenomenal episode in which we go down the rabbit hole of addiction. So without further ado, please welcome my guest, Idan Ariel. And we're off again. My guest here today is Idan Ariel. He's a clinical psychology PhD specializing in treating and researching addiction. How are you, Idan?
Good. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, definitely glad to have you on the show today. So you are a clinical psychology PhD specializing in addiction, as I've mentioned, and you wrote a
Yes.
book titled Addiction, Is It Right for You? On how to be a better addict.
Yes.
What is that about?
It is about how to be a better addict. So, when I started doing therapy for addictions several years ago, I noticed that even though we're trying to help people, we're kind of trying to help people only from the change perspective, and it's very focused on, well, let's talk about the kind of change that you can do. You know, the easiest thing is to go sober. If we can't get you to go sober, maybe we can get you to moderate. If we can't get you to moderate, maybe we could get you to reduce harms. And that's okay, but almost never in a psychologist's office do you get the message that it's okay to be as you are. It's okay to be an addict. Let's talk about how to be better as an addict, how to suffer less, how to be more functional. So I wrote a book basically from merging kind of the user's, the addict's perspective and the psychologist's perspective. It's the same idea as harm reduction, except not with not with that judgmental terminology of harm. Just how to be a better addict.
Mm-hmm. So my understanding is that the idea of getting treatment for addiction is for the individual to refrain or remove that addictive behavior and what they do every
Mm-hmm.
day. So can you kind of explain a bit more about what you mean by empowering that individual to be what they are in their addictive behavior as opposed to removing that behavior?
So, first thing first, um, addiction therapy doesn't really work. Uh, when we're talking about severe addicts, therapy success isn't better than the success of just a person's attempt to do it. Both have low success rates. Um, so when in and yeah and therapy for addictions is very heterogeneous. Sometimes the goal is abstinence, sometimes the goal is kind of religious focused or spirituality focused with an ideology. Sometimes it's harm reduction. It really depends on who you see and what framework they're working in. A good psychologist will always be empowering the person that they're talking to. So it's conceivable that people do this within therapy as well, but it's just not at the level of ideology of this is the system that we're working within, is accepting the person as they are. Almost never. In some schools of thought it is. Um, there's sort of a lot of components to your question, so I'm trying to get them all. As far as empowering goes, a person is who that person is. That's just who they are. And for an addict, that's a person who uses a lot, a substance addict, a person who uses a lot, and a person who has negative consequences from that use, or struggle or anguish from that use. Um, and when I talk about empowering the addict, I'm talking about accepting just good old fashioned humanistic acceptance of the person as they are, valuing that person, their inherent worth as they are, and working from there, from that ground, to say, okay, what can be better? Is it to learn to pace yourself? Is it to learn to cut out the consequences that are most disturbing to you? Um, so, but and like I said, it's really harm reduction, but it comes from that first step of empowerment, of acceptance, acknowledgement, and respect, and kind of not working with, okay, my goal is to get you to reduce. Now, how do we get the person who you are that's kind of wrong to the person that's going to be right, that's going to be reducing or abstaining? No, my goal is to help you be a happier or more functional you. We start off with you, and our goal is to find out where you want to go and go there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I can see it from the perspective of you're not going to be able to force someone to change if they don't want to change. But at the same time, I'm struggling to understand how is it that you help a person who's addicted, for example, to heroin or alcohol, because typically an alcoholic they can be high functioning, but at the same
Mm-hmm.
time they are heavily damaging themselves and those around them by being inebriated all the time. Whereas a heroin
Well, they're
addict,
not necessarily damaging those around them. They could be isolating too.
how so?
Um, just for example, I have a good friend who's um, a high functioning alcoholic. He's been a heavy drinker for many years, and he used to hurt those around him. He used to drink outside and get into trouble and misbehave and that. And his personal improvement has been to just isolate and drink. And there's a tragic element to it, and he's well aware of that. But he never gets into trouble. He never harms people directly. People might get sad from him. They might feel harm because they wish he'd lived differently. But he isn't harming people. He has learned to behave well. He has learned to contain his his being so that he doesn't lash out at people. So he just drinks alone. It's sad, but he's not hurting anyone, and he's worked very hard to get to that point.
I see. So if I understand this right, you are saying the goal of this is to place individuals who have addictions in a position in which they're able to live normal lives, but they handle their addictions in such a way where it doesn't negatively impact those around them to a higher degree and limits their negative harm to themselves. Is that right?
Um, not exactly. The last part, limiting the negative harm to themselves, uh, is one of the main points. The thing is that addiction is very resistant to change, even if you go to therapy. The therapist likes to focus on the change and be optimistic about the change, but the truth is that whether you do nothing or whether you try to defeat your addiction or overcome your addiction, a lot of times the consequence is the same. So the goal of this is to give people an alternative mindset to, I have this disease and I must overcome it. The alternative mindset is, this is who I am right now, and I realize there are some things I want to be better at. And if that thing is to hurt people around you less, or if it then that could be your goal, or if it's to consume less or have less like acute negative consequences. It's all up to the person. I sort of put out kind of a buffet of self-help and like strategies and kind of different things to orient people towards where they want to take their path.
Hmm. So you mentioned that addiction is incredibly difficult to treat.
Hmm.
At the same time, you mentioned that in many ways it's due to the way that many doctors go about treating it. Isn't addiction typically rooted in a deeper issue, such as an individual's need for something?
Well, that is certainly one of the popular views, and I think there's definitely some truth to that, but I think that's a partial truth. Um, Sometimes, and I guess the one other as important component is that addiction is a habit system, and we humans we are habit machines. We create habits that then shape our worlds and the world around us, be they good habits like running, yoga, nutrition, whatever, or bad habits like drinking, binge shopping, binge eating, or what have you. um, but the habit system is really strong, and there is a lot of times I see kind of again, it's not a mistake to say that addiction is rooted in deeper issues, but oftentimes that leads to what I think is a mistaken line of thought, which is, since addiction is rooted in a deeper issue, we must get to the deeper issue to resolve it. But even if it is all rooted in a deeper issue, that doesn't mean that the deeper issue is perpetuating it. What's perpetuating it is a habit system that perpetuates itself.
So if there's a habit system, how do you
Hmm.
go about treating that habit outside of enabling the person to continue with that habit?
I wouldn't say I'm enabling the person to continue. I think the person enables to themselves to continue, and that's kind of the fallacy of like, oh, if we're not driving them to change, we're being irresponsible. No, they're gonna be themselves with or without you and your services.
Right.
Um, as far as how to change a habit, it really is. It's like any other habit. You got to work on it, and you got to find the things that are good for you, that work for you. It could be setting limits. Um, it could be occupying yourself to avoid use at certain points. It could be reminding yourself consistently of your goals to keep you on track. There's no the the nuts and bolts of it are going to be pretty similar to therapy, to good old fashioned cognitive behavioral therapy. Um, you address the behavior, you address ways to modify the behavior, you kind of try techniques until you find something that resonates with the person that works, and you address the cognitive aspect, the thoughts, the frustrations, and in that cognitive realm is where a lot of deeper issues can come in, like, oh, well, I can't stand how my mom talks to me, and that drives me to drinking, and we can unpack that and talk about that some. um, but yeah, it's kind of it's basically the same as therapy, only from a different angle, starting point from a different point of view.
Mm. So if we take any addict, for example, say someone who drinks alcohol, and
Hmm.
they decide to do AA and quit
Yeah.
cold turkey, is that something that's considered to be highly ineffective simply due to the fact that if a person has another drink, they immediately revert back to drinking?
Um, there's kind of a lot of components to what you asked here. I guess I'm not sure what you mean by considered ineffective. They considered by who?
Right. So my understanding, at least, is that when someone attends AA, it's a multi-step program to surround yourself
Hmm.
with people, so you don't bring yourself to drink. I'm not sure what the initial factors are when someone's an alcoholic and what brings them to drink, but
Actually, just alcoholic is a very is kind of an we still use it, but it's an outdated term because it is rooted in that ideology of seeing of seeing the person's condition as a disease,
Mhm.
and it also connotes that mentality of once you're an alcoholic for life. Your only hope is to quit drinking, and one drink can just relapse, make you go into relapse. But uh, just as a semi aside, in the 70s, there's a guy called Alan Marlatt, a psychotherapist, who was the first guy to openly preach moderation management as opposed to abstinence, because back then only abstinence was they'd only do abstinence therapy and anything else was kind of sacrilegious. And Marlatt spearheaded research that showed that actually success rates for abstinence and moderation management were basically the same. People who moderate, some succeed in continuing to be moderate drinkers and some relapse back to heavy drinking. And people who go sober, some succeed and a lot relapse back. Um, so so the yeah, so the term alcoholic is kind of connotes that. Um, with Alcoholics Anonymous, it's this basically religious organization that's religious in terms of spirituality and also religious about not drinking. And they do kind of preach absolute abstinence. Um, but they kind of also talk out of both sides of their mouths because if you're a drinker, and you go to AA and then you have a slip or a relapse and you drink and you tell your sponsor about it, they'll try to get you to a meeting again. So they don't kick you out of the group if you've been drinking. And the reality is a lot of people come there drunk or get drunk right after. So I'm not sure how much of your question I answered there.
No, I think you covered it entirely. Um, I do have to ask though. It seems like the structure we live in is completely upside down because people who struggle with various forms of addiction are looked at with a stigma, and there seems
Hmm.
to be such a taboo against people who have heroin addictions, for example, even though there are ways to manage it through methadone. Why do you think that the views on addiction are so upside down throughout society? And why hasn't the medical, I guess, the medical or scientific community begun to look at it differently to help people become better versions of themselves?
Before I answer that, I actually want to address what she said about methadone. Um, because there is a much better way than methadone, and that is consumption rooms for down and out addicts, uh, places where they could get clean needles and a clean room to do it in, and even just government supplied heroin is much better. Um, I think, and I mean the statistics prove. I don't have statistics offhand, but the statistics are very strong about this. Um, the consumption rooms are really do wonders in helping addicts live better lives, and they have direct economic effects. They make environments safer. They reduce crime. They reduce mortality around addicts. Um, and methadone itself uh, by the way, am I allowed to swear?
Yeah, go for
Okay.
it.
Just before wanted to say that methadone's really shitty. I just wanted to make sure. Methadone is really, really shitty, and so is Suboxone, which is kind of the same principle as methadone. It's a more advanced, more recent drug, but it's the same principle. It's a drug you take for a prolonged amount of time to make it so that you don't use heroin and to kind of serve some of that need. But both both drugs are methadone and Suboxone are supposedly not meant for long term, but people stay on them for years, and they hate it. And this is not in any textbooks, but they say addicts will say that methadone withdrawal can kill you, even though withdrawal from opiates isn't supposed to kill you because physiologically, unlike withdrawal from alcohol, which there's a very clear physiological way in which it can kill you, in with heroin or methadone, there's not. But the methadone withdrawal is so rough that people sometimes get seizures or heart attacks from going through it and die due to basically trauma. Um, so, and that actually gets around to your question of why are things so upside down. A lot of a lot of components relate to it. One of them is the pharmaceutical industry that is making a ton of money from methadone, from Suboxone, and from prescription opioids. Um, and and I think another reason is kind of the mentality towards drug users and drug addicts. What we see today is the product of the last 150 years of regulation. It really started early 19th century, where they started regulating it, and part of it, it's all ugly. The reasons are all ugly. A lot of it was due to racism, and it's kind of a way of population control, because different populations are addicted or using different substances, and if you make a substance illegal that's popular among a certain community, you get to control that community. And I know I'm getting a little I'm getting conspiratorial.
Can we
here.
pause for a second? Because I'm actually
Sure.
just go rewind 1
Sorry.
second here.
Sorry.
You said that some groups are more apt to addiction than others. Are you saying
No. Every human is every humans can go is apt to addiction. Different ethnicities, just by whatever reason, whether it's genetics, culture, or circumstance, different ethnicities develop inclinations towards different substances.
is there? Can you provide a bit more substance to that?
Sure. Um, in the Opium Wars, in 1830, plus minus, the Western nations, I believe led by Scotland, forced China to accept opium imports from the West. And after that, opium use spread throughout the Far East. And then fast forward 70 years or so, and there's Chinese workers imported from China essentially to the U.S. to build the railroad system, trying to stay in the U.S. And then that population gets this negative stereotype of opium use, which in part was true, and in part was exaggerated to control that population. But even the part of it that was true is due to was due to sort of circumstances. But I guess like a less conspiratorial example is just white people in America. They've always drunk. alcohol has been a part of human culture forever, a part of American culture certainly since day one, um, and that's widely accepted. Marijuana was not. Who was smoking marijuana 100 years ago? Black people, Mexican people, and it's no secret that those ethnicities and races had a hard time, right?
Hmm.
So making making that drug illegal meant you now had reasons to put those people in jail. But yeah, the it's just the way it shook out that in those populations, cannabis use was a lot more popular, and that was just those people's addictions.
So you're saying there is this perpetuation of controlling groups through enabling chaos, so to speak, by providing them that certain drug, for example, and then deeming it illegal, for example, through the drug wars in I think the 70s, there is a way for these institutions, such as the government, to bring about control over these substances and to control these groups. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
And it's crazy because that isn't something that's just focused on drugs. That's also applies to technology, food, like you said, alcohol, even caffeine. I mean, companies out there are pouring sugar into cereal boxes, and they're also throwing these things called loot boxes into video games to enable gambling amongst the younger groups. So it seems like the addiction is perpetuating itself across society outside of drug use.
Yeah, and I think there's a cannibalistic aspect to society in that society needs is made up of individuals, and then um, especially with the capitalist societies of the world, what like addiction to whatever video games, sugar, drugs, addictions are perpetuated. Money is made off of creating addictions, and then it gets titled as an epidemic. Uh, the system then gets to build itself around treating the addictions to some degree. Money is made there. In other parts of the problem with drugs, uh, people are incarcerated. Money is made there as well, and it helps society thrive, so to speak. So there's definitely like basically, especially in the U.S., a strong kind of cannibalistic aspect to it that addicts drive a lot of the economy, and the illegal addicts they get to be part of the new slave labor. But by the way, this is not just my crazy ideas. There's this fantastic book. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's called The New Jim Crow.
I have
Uh,
not.
it is written by a woman whose name I forget now, but she worked in the DA, and she started off believing that the system had some flaws, but all in all, was a good system. And after working with drug cases for a long time, she realized that this is kind of institutionally perpetuated predatory behavior towards drug use, and that the drug laws are really meant to create a new a legitimate form of slavery by way of streamlining people into prisons where they can be work for almost nothing and have no choice about it.
That sounds fascinating. It seems almost as though it focuses strictly on the drug aspects of things, even though most institutions these days are enabling society or the younger generations to become more apt to social media and video games,
Hmm.
and yet those aren't heavily stigmatized as much as drugs and alcohol are. Isn't that
Right.
kind of weird, though?
Um, it is, but it also has to do with the consequences and kind of with everything around it, like social media and and video games you do in your own home. The damages to you and maybe to people whose lives you drop out of, but it's not. It doesn't have to do with going somewhere and getting your stuff, paying someone for that fix and kind of for an actual product. And then it doesn't have to do with intoxication either. That's one big difference between drug addictions and other addictions, is the intoxication element that gets a lot of attention. To be fair, it does cause a lot of problems, but I think as problematic is like attitude towards it, and also, I mean, you can't blood test for social media, right?
Right. Now, I gotta
I'm all
ask.
over the place. I apologize
No,
for
it's entirely all right. It's just
confusing.
it's a lot of information. It's just
Fun fact:
yes.
wherever you look, whether it's Sweden or America, if you look, and they've done these studies all over, the gross, annual income of alcohol industry in any place in the world is like 60 to 80% of the purchases are made by problem drinkers,
Wow.
or 60 to 80% of the purchases will be made by about 20 to 30% of the people. And yet they tell you to drink responsibly, but they're not making their money off of the people that drink responsibly.
Right. I, why is it that some individuals are more apt becoming binge drinkers as opposed to others? Because you mentioned most of the purchases of alcohol are made by 60% of people or so. Why is it that those 60 that percentile is addicted to drinking alcohol while the remaining group isn't?
Yeah, not 60, those 30 or
30.
20 or 30. Yeah. Um, that's a difficult question, and really, once you have that group defined, you can say, well, why did they become this? And look for the answer. But the questions you ask are going to lead to the answers you find, and there might not be an answer, a real answer out there. It might be very heterogeneous. It is very heterogeneous, I think, and it's kind of like the usual suspects. Some of it is genetic, a lot of it is genetics, determines the likelihood that someone is going to be develop a drinking problem. But people with huge genetic disposition to drinking often do not develop a drinking problem. um, Sometimes they, saw a lot of bad shit when they were growing up and they knew better. Other times, some other circumstances aligned,
Hmm.
and they just didn't end up that way. Culture definitely contributes to it a lot. Whether you're not just whether you're in a availability as well, how accessible it is to you. Whether when you were young, there are people who could give it to you, but also culture. Like if you think about like the U.S. college cultures where binge drinking is glorified, and I remember when I was in college, we would try to black out. This was the sign of a good night if you blacked out, which is crazy. But there's sort of this culture, and then a lot of people grow out of it too, um, and some don't. But once you get exposed to that, once you become part of it, it just a certain percent is gonna stick to that method of just addressing life through alcohol or whatever substance.
Now, growing up, I believe there were two groups. The first group took a very hardline approach against substances and behaviors that were deemed addictive or in some ways dangerous. At least from what I could tell, this resulted in rebellious behavior due to how these things were characterized. On the other hand, there is the group that is more liberal in their approach. I'm not saying that they encouraged drinking or any other dangerous behavior. They approached it by teaching about it in an objective manner without deeming it to be forbidden and dangerous. From this, people would be less apt to becoming addicted to these behaviors or substances. Is that something you find true?
Well, both approaches are kind of anti-addiction approaches. It's like the implicit tenet of both approaches is that addiction is wrong and that everything should be done to prevent it, and then it's just a question of what is the best way of preventing it.
So neither of them actually prevent individuals from going down that path, you're saying?
Addiction is part of human nature. And I'm just started reading this awesome book that really isn't that famous at all, even though it was written 20 years ago. It's called Addiction is a Choice. And I also don't remember that author's name. But he makes this point that we all have addictions, and it's just that some addictions are virtues because society benefits from them or because they're in line with the ideals. Alan Turing was addicted to coding. He helped win World War II and save us from the Nazis. He was a high-functioning autistic person whose entire life revolved around code, around codes and ciphers, and as addicted to it as anyone can be addicted to anything. But that's not how addiction is conceptualized today. It's conceptualized as a disease and a problem. It carries a lot of stigma. I think the message, if a message, I think the best message would be choose your addictions wisely, and be aware of your addictive tendency.
The title of the book you mentioned is quite ironic because I pulled the quote, and I believe you wrote this. It says, "A consequence you can see coming is a choice, and taking ownership of the choices we've made can reduce pain and suffering." Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit about that and how it relates to that book you just mentioned, if it does relate?
Yeah, that by the way was told to me by one of the best clinical supervisors I ever had. He was referring to someone binge eating, and the therapist that was being trained was struggling with someone who was having issues with binge eating, and the supervisor was explaining, well, if we got her to see that the decisions that she was making were going to lead her down the path of going, like driving to the McDonald's or whatever, mm-hmm. going down another episode of binge eating, and she could see that consequence coming ahead of time before she engaged in the behavior, then that's her choice and that's her right. So to carry on with the example of binge eating is not for everyone, but for a lot of people I've spoken to, it's a mixed bag of ecstasy and agony, because you just lose yourself in the eating and the devouring nonstop of whatever it is that you like, and it's this wonderful escape on the other one hand, and on the other hand it's filled with self-loathing and this desire to not be you and not to think about anything. And after you finish the binge, it's just this regret and this self-deprecating thoughts, and you can't really, that cycle of eat or use to escape and then feel bad about your escaping, and then probably use or eat some more to get away from the feeling bad, you can't really snap your fingers and take yourself out of it. But when you experience it as something that is happening to you, it is a lot more painful. When you experience it as a disease that I just cannot possibly control, and why am I like this, and why can't I be something else, and why am I not normal, and all that, that's that's extra pain you don't need. You can do without by just saying, you know what, this is fucked up, but this is a choice I made. This is a choice I planned for. And I don't like it, but this looking at the mirror and seeing the face and calling it disease, that's just hurting me more. This is who I am now. When I want to change, I can, but right now I'm making the choice of I'm taking these actions, and I already know what the consequence is going to be because I've lived it 1,000 times before. Therefore, it's my choice, and that's my right.
It's not that simple, though, is it? Although somebody has the choice to not binge eat, for example, there are certain internal factors involved that perpetuate you towards that behavior, even if you have the choice to not do it. And that kind of results in people who drink alcohol, and they are currently in a situation in which they're cold turkey, but when they see that drink, they may have the choice not to drink it, but for some reason or another, they still take that drink. Why is that? Why is it that they can't control them? Why is it that they, although they have that choice, they choose to drink?
Well, I do not believe that they can't control it. I believe, and I think your question comes from somewhat of a traditional view, and sort of, okay, so let me give you the answer that I don't believe in. There's a lot of research done about genetics or about the brain, the reward pathway, the mesolimbic dopaminergic pathway in the brain that encodes reward and expectation of reward. And they've done a lot of studies where they show that people who use cocaine are addicted to cocaine, or that gamblers, they now have, like, their brain, the system that is supposed to code natural rewards in the brain, sex, food, water, that system has sort of been hijacked by the drug to the point where now that system doesn't encode reward, or doesn't encode it as powerfully, unless it's that one specific reward that the person is addicted to. So the one of the kind of, I believe someone from NIDA, the National Institution of Drug something or other research, drug and alcohol, I guess, drug and addiction. Sorry. Anyway, someone, that's kind of the NIDA stance, is that the brain has been rewired as a symptom of this disease, and that now these people are unable to control their behavior. I don't think anyone is unable to control a behavior. I think consciousness dictates that you are able to avoid some reflexes you cannot control, actions you can. But again, the habit system is very, very strong, and impulses are also very strong. So it's not like your ability to control it means that it's easy or even feasible for at all times, but you have to take actions to get that drink, to score that heroin, or to get the dozen burger special, or whatever it is. You have to take actions. You have to meditate and plan how you're going to do that. That's a decision point, and you always have the ability to make other decisions. Sometimes it's going to feel impossible. Oftentimes you will feel imprisoned by your impulses, tormented by them. Sure, I'm not negating any of that, but there is always a choice.
Mm. Do you think that time plays a major role in addiction? So, to clarify on that, basically, if somebody has been a smoker for 5 years as opposed to 6 months, does that change their ability to refrain from that substance?
Certainly, it's a habit. So the longer a habit has been, um, the longer the habit has been practiced, the more instantiated it is. Plus, with substances, it's different with every substance, but very true for nicotine. There is that issue of dependence. As a smoker for 5 years, your nicotine dependence is much more advanced than it is after 6 months.
So, is habituation and addiction uh, a layer of one another, or is there a clear distinction between the two?
Um,
Because having a habit is continuously doing something over time, whereas an addiction is a reliance on doing that same action over time. So, what's the clear line between the two?
Well, there isn't one because addiction is not well defined at all. Addiction, in the traditional sense, not the traditional sense, classically, like more than 100 or maybe 50 years ago, the word addiction had a different meaning. That meant that someone basically does a lot of something or that a lot of their time goes to something. It only became this stigma in the last century or half a century. Um, and the word addiction is really it's like alcoholism. It's a word that has a lot of stigma and a lot of inaccuracies and a lot of ideological interpretation of the world kind of sewn into it. The and by the way, the to strengthen that point, in the DSM-5, the American Bible of mental health disorders, you're not going to find addiction described. Maybe addictive behavior disorders, but they talk about substance use disorder, marijuana use disorder, alcohol use disorder, and so on. And that's because that they can define very clearly. And before they had that, they had uh, substance dependence and substance abuse disorders. Excuse me. Sorry. Um, so, so that word addiction isn't a very scientific word, and it carries in it with it a lot of kind of confusing assumptions. Um, for me, addiction is two things. It's a formed habit system and uh, a set of negative consequences or mental anguish or suffering that you get. It's for me the thing that we call addiction today is two parts. The thing something that you do a lot, you do compulsively or obsessively or just for a lot of your time, and there are negative consequences or you suffer.
I see. In 1960, there was a self help book written by a surgeon by the name of Dr. Maxwell Maltz called Psychocybernetics. And in that book, he mentioned it takes 21 days to form a habit. And this idea has had a bunch of different variations in terms of the time frame it takes for an addiction to form. There have been some people that said it takes 66 days, 18 days, 254 days to form a habit.
Uh-huh.
Do you think there is some validity to that? And if
No.
that is the case, then
Sorry.
that's basically implying there's a way to get rid of certain habits, if that's the case.
Oh, there are certainly ways to get out of habits. The easiest way, by the way, is to uh, move towards an environment in which that habit is not possible.
Such as,
If you go to a cabin in the woods, um, no, I'm serious. if you live, it might be unrealistic, but if you went to somewhere where you could not get alcohol, you would not have a drinking problem. You would have a place where you could stay away from alcohol, and you could get that out of your system. But here's the thing, kind of a chemical equivalent of that cabin in the woods that isolates you from alcohol, there is a medication called antabuse. And what antabuse does, I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
I have not.
Antabuse, it's been around for a while, for at least 20 years, probably more. And antabuse uh, makes a poisonous reaction in your body the second you take alcohol, even a small amount of alcohol. It's so powerful that if people are on it, they need to avoid mouthwash with alcohol in it, because just that amount can cause them. It basically gives you an instant hangover if you bring any alcohol into your body. It makes you nauseous, it makes you sweat, all the bad stuff. And you would so this should have solved alcoholism, right? This should have solved the habit, because you can have someone on antabuse for 30 days. They even have, I believe by now they have injection antabuse that lasts in your system for 30 days or 60 days. So you could do that, and that habit should be solved, right? Because that hit that mark of 21 days or whatever.
I
But
mean, it sounds like Pavlov's dog. I mean, you're basically pairing a stimulus with a conditional response.
how so?
You're giving the person the antabuse,
Mm-hmm.
and anytime they have a sip of alcohol, there is that negative reaction, which
Mm-hmm.
results in that individual not wanting to drink. If each time they try to take a sip of alcohol and they see that negative reaction, wouldn't that
Yeah.
form a negative connotation with alcohol?
Yeah, that's a different thing actually. That's called aversion therapy, and there's other medications for that with smoking. And they also had, actually, I heard a story recently of, they had aversion therapy here in Portugal where they just give people wine. They put them in a cell, they give them wine, then they beat the shit out of them every time they touch the wine. This
Wow.
happened. And works for some people. Antabuse isn't actually aversion therapy, because it's so bad that you don't relearn it. You just know not to do it, because you don't get, so it doesn't, it's too severe to be aversion therapy.
Hmm.
Like there's a medication called Chantix for smoking, and what it does is it cuts away the rewarding aspect of smoking, so that if a smoker takes Chantix and smokes a cigarette, now they feel like a non-smoker smoking a cigarette. They don't get the benefit, and they just like feel like they're inhaling smoke, which is aversive to a non-smoker. And then the therapy actually says, don't stop smoking. You're still supposed to smoke the same amount of cigarettes a day, and train yourself to smoke that despite it being obnoxious and unpleasant.
Hmm.
And that way you will learn the association.
So you mentioned that there are some substances out there which bring about negative feelings when taking those drugs. But isn't there another way of going about it, which is tapering off that substance? So, for example, if someone smokes 5 cigarettes a day, they can slowly taper off from it to 3 cigarettes a day, to 2 cigarettes a week, and then to 1 cigarette every 2 weeks. Isn't that also something that would work?
Yeah, I mean, it is a strategy that's worked for people. Um, Again, success rates are very low, so that you have these different strategies, and they work for some people and they don't for others. So tapering off has helped um, some people. That's how you're supposed to use nicotine replacement products, actually, is to taper off. You start with the heavy patch for 2 weeks, and then you go off you go off with with medium patch and the small patch, and eventually you're supposed to be off it completely. Tapering works for some people and it doesn't for others, because addiction is like trying to deal with your addiction is trying to deal with your impulse control, and that often fails.
Hmm.
But I did want to say something to kind of complete the thought about what you said about the habit forming. Is the reason I mentioned the antabuse is just to kind of debunk that habit forming thing, because people will stop using alcohol as long as they're on antabuse, and they can go for a month or two. But the reason antabuse fails is because eventually people stop taking it, and that happens after weeks or even months where they lived without that habit. So that idea of 21 or 66 or 259, or however many days to reform your habit, that's overly simplistic. Some habits, yeah, you probably only need 21 days to get into the habit of flossing. But to get into the habit of not solving your existential misery with alcohol, that habit takes more than 21 days to form.
Right. So, do you think it's a bad idea to force yourself to quit a certain habit? I mean, if we look at it, there are groups out there who perpetuate the idea that you need to go cold turkey, you need to take certain steps to avoid that certain behavior or drug or whatever it may be. And you'll hear stories about the person saying, you know what, I made it 30 days, I made it 60 days, I made it 90 days, but I relapsed. But they still continue down that path because they believe it is beneficial to them. Do you think there is some harm that could be caused by attempting to reduce or remove a habit over a long period of time?
Definitely. And I think the most important thing is not to quit for the sake of quitting, but to quit for the sake of something of value to you. Whether it's your health, your mental health, your time with family, uh, your career goals, or whatever it is, I think I think quitting is best when it has meaning. When your chief meaning is, I'm going to try with all my strength to not use again today, or I can't possibly use today. This is the most important thing. That's what sometimes is called white knuckling it. That's like trying with all your might not to do a thing, which can succeed, but is very difficult and is not as meaningful as your child's face, wanting to be there, not wanting to be drunk daddy who's out of commission, you know uh, but 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 to answer your question more directly, I think when you're talking about a serious habit that you're trying to break, there is going to be a cost, because you use for reasons. Sometimes those deep rooted reasons that we mentioned earlier, maybe some childhood trauma, or not like necessarily the PTSD trauma, but just suffering that you've accumulated throughout your life that you're carrying on your shoulders, and that you're running away from, or anxiety, or to whatever. There are reasons you are using. And I like to think of it in terms of energy. Your energy flows towards use. If you're a daily drinker or marijuana user, your anxious energy, or your escapist energy, whatever it is, it flows towards the use. If you take the use out, that energy is going to clash inside of you and go somewhere else. It might go towards a different behavior, a different addictive behavior. It might go towards lashing out at people, or misbehaving, or taking risk. It might go inside and just eat you up from the inside. It might turn in on itself and cause you a lot of anxiety or depression. So when you're trying to quit just for the sake of quitting, and that's kind of you're white knuckling it, that comes at a huge cost. And I don't think every moment in life is good for that. So if you are working like a 70-hour week job and you hate it and it's really bad for you and your social life is suffering because you don't really have time to do anything other than work, sleep, and get drunk. Uh, like if you try to cut out the alcohol from your life at that point, your main support structure, other stuff is going to go wrong because you're dependent on that, and you don't have the life resources now to make that change. You're very taxed and fatigued in your life, and that's kind of keeping you hanging on. So I think that in certain situations, I guess just to complete the thought. So at worst, what someone can have, what someone can get suicidal and just very depressed or self-harming to themselves because without the escape of the drugs, they want a more radical escape. So I think there are many ways in which quitting can go wrong. Um, and I don't think every time is the right. I don't think every time's the right time for it.
You mentioned some aspects of anxiety, stress, and whatnot, and some of those also include boredom, lack of sleep as well, fatigue. Do you think those play a huge role in relapse? And if so, why do you think that is the case?
Yeah, excuse me. I definitely think they they can play a role in relapse. Um, there's a decent social psychology theory out there about self-control being a muscle, and that you can conceptualize it as a muscle in terms of you can let muscles atrophy and you can strengthen them by training, but you can also put too much on your muscle and tear it. And I think that's a decent way of looking at relapse, especially when the relapse is for someone who's been trying to go stone cold sober. Um, is is that you only have so much self control, um, and there are things, and if I have a decent job and a decent social life, and things are more or less okay, I'm probably gonna have and self control reserves enough to be able to focus it on one heavy lifting task. But if I am overworked and fatigued, um, and it just takes really most of my ability to just get through my day, my self control muscle is going to be close to maximum capacity. So I think relapse definitely happens. That's one of the ways that it happens, is that it is just too much control. Another way relapse happened, by the way, is you just start to miss it, because like the first week or so, you might feel great to not be hungover every day, or stoned and out of commission every day. But after a while, when you start to get some improvements and you start mitigating some of your negative consequences, that hunger, that craving for a different state of mind, or for that kind of chemical relief, that
Hmm.
builds up, and then it's not necessarily an issue of that self control muscle tearing. It's really what in some rehab circuits is called coming down with a case of the fuck it's.
So,
Just yeah.
yep, go ahead if there was a.
Uh, yeah, just to wrap the thought up, is like people sometimes think that, why am I using, because even though I don't want to. And I disbelieve that. I think that people have a fantasy that they want one thing, but really we just want conflicting things, and sometimes one desire is stronger than the next. And I think I think another thing that really makes relapse happens is just a change of priorities. I quit because I really wanted to be sober. That want at that point was much stronger than my want to get high, even though that want was there. And then things fluctuate over time, and after 20 days or however many, I just want to get high much more than I want to stay sober. I came down with a case of the fuck it's and, you know, said fuck it.
So, on the topic of wanting, and this is going in a different direction to a degree, there is the idea that falling in love can be addicting because it basically increases the serotonin and dopamine levels in the brain by a tremendous amount. Is that, do you believe in that belief
I don't
system?
think the dopamine and serotonin explanation is necessary. I think love is 100% an addiction. You can just see it with your eyes. Like a lot of times, the ability to look inside the brain to some degree has it's sort of like the new voodoo is like people put so much emphasis on it and how much it tells us, but the brain is so insanely complex that those explanations are often oversimplistic, and often they don't tell you much than just the behavior is going to tell you. A person who is in love is always wanting to be with the object of their love. When they are not with them, they perseverate on it inside their mind. They experience withdrawal, their mood slumps, their functioning is not as good. They get a fix of their loved one, and they're good to go for the day. As long as they know they get to go back to their love, they can do any shitty job. Just give them their fix of love. It's a great addiction.
So, do you think that on the same topic, do you think that everybody in a happy marriage, for example, has a love addiction, or is that only for certain individuals?
I think it's only for certain. I think I don't know if it's only for certain individuals, like only certain individuals will develop it, but I think that the love. That's a difficult question. I guess there's different types of addicted love, you know. There's the romantic kind of first months of the relationship, or there's kind of the burning fire of love that most couples don't sustain for their lifetime because it's unsustainable. It's all encompassing. Um, but you know, but then there's the living a life together and just being part of each other's lives. And you know, some people do it and either they suffer or they're just, it's not that they suffer, it's just how they live their life, and they're not necessarily feeling that much love, you know. It's
Hmm.
just like a good cohabitation or a livable cohabitation situation. So I really think I kind of got lost on answering this, to be honest. um, I think it depends. There's kind of the fiery, really addicted to you kind of thing that you mostly see in the first year of the relationship, but then some people just developed a codependency over the years, and they become codependent for a very long amount of time, and that can be an addiction too. It just depends on the individuals. Yeah.
So you're saying that addiction transfers from addiction of love to an addiction of codependence on that other individual, correct?
Um, I didn't really mean to say that. I'm just saying there's kind of. I'm saying there's if you're gonna call it an addiction, if you're gonna conceptualize it as an addiction, as something that is uh, powered by a strong habit system, and comes along with a dependence and negative consequences if the dependence cannot be fulfilled, then I would say, well, there's two versions of it, and which is, one is that passionate first months or first year of a relationship, and the other is the long term codependence. But that's not really me. That's kind of the psychological study wisdom, is that
Hmm.
that's the life cycle of a relationship, is that in the beginning you have romantic life, and you have romantic life be take a more central role, and as time goes by, it's more about a shared life, shared habits, and then in some versions codependence.
Hmm. Now, as we kind of enter the closing
Hmm.
part of the episode, I wanted to turn the attention to your role as a clinical psychology PhD.
Yes.
What would you tell people who are interested in getting into the clinical psychology field in terms of advice for them?
I usually say don't do it.
Why is that?
um, if you want to be a helper for other people, um, then a master of social work or masters in counseling is going to get you there, and going to get you to the point where you're allowed to get licensed and see people and help them. I have really strong criticisms over the psychology field, um, and I think um, I think a, a lot of clinical psychology is just very misled. And when you go to a clinical psychology PhD program, it is an insane amount of work. You're working 3 to 4 part-time jobs at any given moment. You're working on your own research. You are working on clinical work. That's part of your training. Then you're taking classes, and sometimes you graduate out of taking classes, but you need more clinical work, so you take another part-time position or more research or all those things. Um, it gets to be an insane load of work for a very long amount of time, and then it can take you. Sometimes it takes, some people finish it in 5 years, but 6 is more common. 7 happens a lot. For me, it took 9, which was really bad. But
Wow.
and it's not over, because after that you have to get your internship in the US, and in my home country of Israel. Getting an internship is very difficult, and you might have to take more than 1 year to get it. In Israel, you have to work half-time internship for 4 years. In America, it's just 1 year, but it takes an insane amount of effort, and they work you like a slave. And after that, you're not licensed yet either. You still have to do a clinical postdoc, or you have to do more clinical stuff. And by the time you are a licensed clinician able to practice, it has been 10 years, thousands upon thousands of hours of work, um, lots and lots and lots of sacrifices made for this career that a lot of times is going to keep you struggling and keep you enslaved to your work. So if you want to make money off of a career, the amount of work that you're going to need for to become a licensed clinical psychologist, you can make a lot more money putting those hours of work somewhere else. If you want to be a helper, you can get to that point of meeting people, being licensed and meeting people and making a positive change in people's lives. You can make that point a lot faster. So clinical psychology is is best for people who kind of want to be able to do therapy and teach and do research and kind of have all the world of psychology open to them. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, I think you did. For
I tend to run on if you hadn't noticed.
no, it's all right. For all the work you put in, 10 years or so, there has to be some positive that has come out of that. Do you what would you say is the most fascinating thing you've learned,
Hmm.
or the most fascinating idea that is being proposed or in theory currently within your field?
So it's hard to choose one, and it's so varied. Uh, Honestly, what we mentioned earlier, a consequence you can see coming as a choice, is just one simple idea that blew my mind and really refined how I talk to people. Um, I guess another idea, and so none of these are recent ideas, but one idea, a reconceptualization of dopamine was a fascinating thing to me because dopamine is viewed simplistically as um, a kind of the thing that codes reward in your brain. But it's not that simple, and a lot of the evidence shows that maybe it doesn't really code reward so much as anticipation as reward of reward. And the role of anticipation in reward seeking behavior, and how basically all reward seeking behavior is an aspect of pre-acquired knowledge, memory, uh, and how you really can't, you really have to put down arbitrary lines to separate memory from anticipation to
Hmm.
action. This is kind of a long, complex answer, but you asked for the most revolutionary thing, so it goes one level deeper, and that is, if you look at dopamine. So there's um, Parkinson's disease, or let's start with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is too much dopamine in the brain, and that leads to all sort of thought aberrations and behavior problems. Um, and then Parkinson's disease is a shortage or a malfunctioning of dopamine in the brain, and that leads to all sorts of bad symptoms, and the shaking, the tremors, and it's a movement disorder. So this thing, dopamine, that we're talking about as the thing that encodes reward, that is also the thing that makes movement happen. That is a neurotransmitter that's chiefly responsible for intentional movement. And by the way, when you give people with Parkinson's L-Dopa or other medications designed to increase the levels of dopamine in the brain, at high levels they will develop schizophrenic symptoms, and some of them will develop addictive behaviors just from this increase of dopamine. So the mind-blowing idea was how intentional movement, memory, anticipation, and reward seeking behavior are all just one glob of this human organism that just moved towards consumption for survival, or in our day and age for pleasure or what have you, and that it's all one thing, and that it's just our language and our studying things and separating them, teasing them out and calling them different things and studying them separately, but that it's all interrelated. It's all really the same thing. And when you look at dopamine and its functions all over, and its various functions and how interconnected they are, you see that.
Wow. That is something I've never heard of before. That's quite fascinating to see it from that perspective, really. Before we close things off,
Yes.
I want to get your moral of the story and what would be your greatest piece of advice for people out there who struggle with addiction and who want to live a more functional life with that addiction?
Mm. See, so there's a lot of things there. What would be um, one piece of advice? That's pretty limiting.
You can make it three pieces of advice.
uh, I'm just trying to think. So self acceptance, accepting who you are for who you are, is one of that for whatever it is, and then from that place of acceptance, opening up yourself to thinking, what do you want out of life? So I guess my one piece of advice is addiction does not occur in a vacuum. Addiction is one habit system out of your whole life that is a bunch of other habit systems, thoughts, beliefs, personality. So for the struggling addict, I would say, start with accepting the situation as it is today. Let go of that thought, that anxious or stressed thought for a second of I have to change. You can go back to it later. But think for a second about the positives, the negatives. Accept your situation. Use that acceptance to really look around you, see how you tick, how your addiction ticks, and see how it fits into your life. And from that, go to what you want out of life, and what you want to be different. And don't solve this problem too quickly. This is not a one session question. You've been an addict for a long while. You've been using it a lot of times. You can reflect during those times as you disappoint yourself. Keep thinking about what you want to be different and the different components. Um, and then choose wisely. Choose wisely what you're going to be addicted to, because you can get addicted to better habits. You can get addicted to a family life or love or to nutrition or veganism or religion. Um, so my one piece of advice, so the one piece, two piece advice is start with acceptance and a drive to self-knowledge, and then move towards taking the most out of your self-control, getting the most bang for your buck for your self-control, and really focusing your attempt at self-control at a meaningful change and a realistic change, because your energy will go somewhere. We all need to be addicted to something to fill our lives. So choose that wisely and have the acceptance and self-knowledge that you've gained guide your choice. Let me throw in one other thing in there. Okay, completely nuts and bolts. If you're an addict and you're completely lost at what to do, look at the quantity of the frequency of what you use. Any other part of the narrative is very important, but the quantity and frequency is like the speed of is like how fast the car is going. It tells a part of the story, and that's always going to be a fundamental part. So if you do nothing else, look at the quantity and frequency. And if you don't know where to start with seeing if you can reduce that to some degree. If you want to, of course.
That was very well put and very well said, Idan.
Thank you.
And
You reminded me, this is off topic, but you reminded me of there's this story about Hillel, a famous Jewish luminary, and some non-Jewish person went to him and said, uh, stood on one foot and said, "Tell me the entire Torah." And Hillel said, "Love thy brother." And then he went to somebody else, Shammai, and Shammai uh, took a club and knocked his one foot from the ground. That was
Huh.
completely unrelated to anything.
I'm
But
curious as to know what is the dichotomy there between those two stories.
what between it just when you said what's the one thing, it was like I thought to myself, I wish I had an answer as good as Hillel's answer. That was just one beautiful principle that just
Right.
streamlined everything.
So what was the point of him knocking his foot with the club?
Those were two rival, those Hillel and Shammai were two rival schools of thought of how the laws of Judaism are going to be interpreted. And Hillel's school ended up uh, winning, but Hillel was more tolerant, and the Shammai school of thought is was very, very strict. So he just had no time for that.
Well, nonetheless, I really appreciate you taking the school of thought to explain your side of the story and your perspectives
Yeah,
when
thank
it
you
comes
so
to
much.
addiction. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you and getting some insight into what is addiction and all the kind of aspects involved with it, as well as how can an individual become a better addict. Uh,
Before we go, I just wanted, if I can, to plug my
mhm.
website.
Yes, please do.
Thank you. So I do basically life coaching and consultation for substance users or people living with substance users. It's not therapy. It's basically kind of a short-term consultation service. And the first session is free, and the website is idanarielconsultation.net. And if you heard this podcast and you or someone you know might be interested, go ahead and book yourself a free session. And if you like this uh, weird, weird sporadic wisdom that I tried to spit, then you can. Well, you won't get that in a session. You'll get much more focused, but you get a sense of what it's like to talk to me.
And for those interested in reading your book, Addiction, Is It Right for You? Where can they
Yes.
find it?
It is on Amazon, available on Amazon Kindle and paperback. And right now it's exclusively on Amazon. And just type in that term by now brings up that book, but if you write addiction Idan Ariel in the search, it goes there as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Idon. I
Yeah,
really
thank you
appreciate
so
you taking the
much.
time to sit down and talk about this fascinating topic with me and for my listeners as well.
It's been
Thank
a
you.
pleasure. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Take care. Bye. Thank you all for tuning into the episode. This conversation was incredibly insightful, and I really hope all of you gained some newfound insights into the topic as well. I truly believe that this was an important episode that deep dived into the struggles of addiction that many are faced with today. From uncovering the misconceptions and negative stigmas to learning that it is possible to be a better version of you. If you or anyone you know is struggling with addiction, know that you aren't alone and that there are resources out there to help. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the All Things Interesting podcast on your favorite platform and follow me on Twitter and Instagram for the latest updates. Until then, thank you for listening and stay tuned for new blogs and episodes of the All Things Interesting podcast.